Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Friday and another episode of the Hot Mess Life Coach. I'm your host, Brian Hogan, both a hot mess and a life coach. And I'm here today with my co-host, Morgan Barbrett, also a life coach. She'll let you know if she's a hot mess. How are you today, Mo?
I'm doing great, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. This is the show for people trying to get it together while the world seems to fall apart. And as part of that, we want to open up the conversation about emotions. So if you're joining us for the first time today, we've been talking about emotions for all of season 5. And today we're going to switch it up a little bit and we're going to talk about contentment because we've been talking about anger, greed, a lot of the more difficult emotions so far, overwhelm. And today we want to switch gears a little bit and talk about contentment, what it is, how it's different than happiness, and most importantly, how to cultivate it and why that's a good idea.
Yeah, something we were saying right before we hopped on is that it is more difficult to come up with like stories and things to talk about with the positive emotions than it is to talk about some of the more like negative emotions, especially since like a lot of the negative emotions get triggered frequently in our lives, whereas like some of the more positive ones are things that like you have to work towards, and then perhaps unfortunately experience less frequently.
Yeah, it's so interesting that we're so focused on the positive. Like we want to find happiness, we want to cultivate joy. And yet it's actually harder to come up with examples of those. Our
Mm-hmm.
focus is on them all the time. Let me have it, let me get it, let me find it. And yet we don't even quite know what it would be like to have it or how to explain it or examples of it. And yet we can there's a flood of examples of the negative because that's also the culture that we have been born into and grew up into. It's a culture that says, yes, let's have all the positive, but then instead literally glorifies all the negative. I mean, this is not a moral judgment, but just as a mechanical fact, thinking about all of the types of media we have and the vast percentage of that media that is focused on getting inside the mind of a serial killer.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
interesting. That's a
That is
focus.
interesting. That's a word. Yeah, that's interesting.
It's just a demonstration of our focus as a society on, even though we say we want the positive, we're focused on and fascinated by and bewitched about the more difficult.
More negative. Yeah. So, what is contentment? How do we
Yeah.
define it?
Well, I have the dictionary definition, which I always like to start with, and then I've also got like a little bit of the language history. So the way Merriam-Webster describes this is the degree of happiness which consists in being satisfied with present conditions, a quiet, uncomplaining, satisfied mind, or content. And this definition is like all, but I feel like there's more to it. And the the root from Latin, it comes from this word contentus, which actually means to hold together, and it also means intact or whole. And it was first described, this word, to describe containers, like you would use this word to describe barrels and buckets and things like that. And over time it evolved into being this word that would describe people also. And it was like how complete you feel as a human being. So
Mm,
that definition feels more useful to me than trying to describe it as just like a feeling of satisfaction, because contentment is more pervasive. Contentment
yeah.
is like a, as the root thing from Latin says, it holds together. Like within contentment can be many things. You can be both content and sad, content and terrified. So contentment is this way of being that we choose to cultivate underneath and separate from the experiences that we're having in the world. So you can be content in the midst of tragedy, where you can't
Yeah.
necessarily be happy in the midst of tragedy, because happiness is something else entirely from contentment.
Hmm.
Culture makes us
Yeah.
feel incomplete and trauma makes us feel broken, but neither one is true. We are complete and we are undamaged at that core place.
So, feeling content is being in touch with the fact that like you're still whole even if things are going wrong in your life or even if things are difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way of putting it. Like I kind of see it as like contentment is like this the gateway. Contentment is, it's it's so much more than just one single emotion. Like as I was looking into it this morning, like I was getting really excited because I was like, wow, contentment, what we use the word contentment to describe this emotional state, it's
Mhm.
actually sort of the same thing that mystics have been using for thousands of years to sort of describe the feeling of non-attachment and non-grasping and that feeling of awakening and enlightenment, like all of those,
Yeah.
the transcendent states that we talk about and that we want to attain or achieve, those are contentment. And or
Yeah.
they emanate from contentment. Contentment is like the bottom base layer prerequisite for for that kind of like depth. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a feeling of okayness and, like, enoughness, but not in, like, the sense that, you know, you say somebody, starts a project and they really, like, not just half-ass it, but quarter-ass it, and they're like, "Good enough. I don't wanna care about it." Like, it's not, like, complacency or, like, a passivity. It's sincerely feeling okay, as in, like, at peace with the way things are,
Yeah.
and to not have any resistance to it, and like you said, to not be attached to, like, forcing a change in it.
Mm. Yeah. So it's interesting that you brought up the idea of complacency too and how they're different. That got me thinking as you're talking, like complacency, like you can have that sort of, oh, I don't care, I'm detached, but if you're complacent and you're not really content with that decision, then it comes with also like a low level feeling of anxiety. Potentially there might be guilt
Yeah,
there. Potentially there might be regret there. I'm not saying this
or
because like you
yeah,
should feel guilty or you should regret. It's not shoulds. It's like these are the results. Like if you're doing something from a place of contentment, you're not going to have those results. But if you're doing,
underlying emotions.
yeah, exactly. But if you're doing something from a different place, like the motive is, oh, I don't want to have to do my presentation in front of class, so I'm just gonna not do it at all, right? Like to get out.
Yeah,
So like that's, but you're gonna be filled with tension and fear as it leads up to that class deadline, for example. So
mhm,
like that's not really contentment, that's avoidance.
mhm, yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, I think we can continue kind of exposing what contentment is by comparing it to what it's not, and I know in the definition it said contentment is a, uh degree of happiness, but it is different from the emotion of happiness. So even though it's like a form of it, kind of, um, it's still slightly different. So what's different about the emotion of happiness and the state of being content?
Yeah. Okay. Ooh, great question. Immediate things come to mind for me. One is happiness is temporary.
Mhm,
Happiness is ephemeral. Happiness is like it's also dependent on factors outside of you.
mhm,
Um, Whereas contentment, on the other hand, is as you cultivate it and it really starts to take hold, it's not temporary. It's much more longer lasting. And as you really cultivate it in your life, it's harder to knock it out.
mhm,
And it doesn't have a sense of diminishing returns about it. It's the opposite.
mhm.
Like contentment, the more you cultivate it, the deeper and deeper and deeper and more content you feel, despite whatever's happening externally. Whereas happiness is entirely state dependent on the state of the outside world.
Yeah. Yeah, so normally when people think of, like, happiness and wanting to be happy, they associate it with what we call the arrival fallacy. So if you have a goal, um, you may tell yourself, I will be happy when I achieve this goal. But what happens for most human beings on the entire history of the planet is once you achieve a goal, you feel briefly happy, and then the goalpost moves. And then it moves
Mhm.
again, and you keep achieving, and it keeps moving. And then you get to the end of your life, and you're like, I achieved all these things. Why do I not feel content?
Yeah. Oof. That the arrival fallacy. I first of all, I've never heard it put that way, but I love that name. And as I was reading up about this, I read this story about this group of research that like literally they wanted their goal was find out which emotions are universal and how do all different cultures like interpret and deal with all the different emotions. And so they went at one point to the Himalayas, like they drove through like a jungle and over a mountain and hiked and like, you know, traversed a waterfall, all kinds of stuff to get to this, like one of the last 3 villages on the planet where people are uncontacted by the outside world. So they don't have media. They don't have culture the way we have it. They have their own
Right. Their
completely
own. Yeah.
encapsulated, you know, and um, what they discovered through all of their research was that there's kind of 2 main strategies that people employ to find this feeling that of satisfaction, which like they actually go for happiness, but what people are trying to get is contentment. So the one strategy is the more strategy, which is what our culture completely like backs and promotes. And the more strategy leads to what you're describing, which is this arrival fallacy, which is I'm going to find happiness by getting more. I'm going to find happiness by doing the next. I'm going to find happiness by achieving the final thing, whatever. And so
Or
as
by
we
consuming.
by consuming in whatever way it is, yeah, consuming,
Yeah.
achieving, like amassing, and as we check the boxes and get the credentials and you know earn the living and all that different stuff, like it continues to it makes us happy for a moment, like a hit, like a hit of a drug, and then it has a diminishing return. Like if somebody gives you $1,000, you're going to be happier momentarily, but as soon as you put that $1,000 in your pocket, that happiness is already going to start to fade, even in that moment. Whereas that's not
This
true about contentment.
this reminds me of like, a lot of people dream of winning the lottery and they think they're going to be so happy if they win the lottery. And there's all sorts of research that shows that a lot of people who do win the lottery have like a steep decline in their life satisfaction because of how complicated their lives get after they win the lottery. So, for example, if you win the lottery and you have like this actually happens like a lot. Somebody wins the lottery, and then there's all these taxes that are associated with it. And so, what you actually bring home is a fraction of what you thought you won. And sometimes people just like go out and spend everything that they thought they won, and then they're immediately bankrupt, immediately in the hole, even after they just won millions of dollars. And then they have all this stress in their life that they didn't have before, all because they had this seemingly happiness bringing thing happen to them.
Yeah, exactly. That it's I think the people who win the lottery and then it doesn't go well is a great example of like sort of that you will always your identity, like how you identify is where you will stay in your life. Like, you know what I mean? And so like
Oh,
you're
interesting.
the person who wins the lottery is not inhabiting the identity of like a wealthy person who can handle all that money, and so
Mm,
they end up over time right back to the identity that is comfortable for them. You know what I mean?
mm,
Which is because of the way culture teaches us to go after more. An identity of it being in the pursuit of more is much more comfortable than say the identity of having enough, which is what happens to you if you win the lottery. You then suddenly have enough. But if that feels foreign, then you have to work your way back into a circumstance that feels more familiar. And so you do that unconsciously. And it looks to the rest of the world like self sabotage.
yeah. Well, I would still call it self sabotage in some some sense,
Oh yeah, I
but
mean, sure, yeah,
yeah,
for sure. The reason I brought that up, the more strategy as it relates to the arrival fallacy, that's what you call it, is
yeah, yeah.
the other strategy that people can use to sort of cultivate this feeling in their lives is the enough strategy. That's the and that the more strategy leads you to happiness, which is temporary, and so
Hmm.
you know it doesn't last, and you're annoyed after. But the enough strategy leads you to contentment by helping you find the happiness that is intrinsic to your nature as a person who is alive, and
Hmm.
that's very hard. It's even weird to say because I know it's hard for people to hear. Like, what do you mean the happiness that's intrinsic to me from being alive? Because we're taught, like in this culture specifically, to ignore the internal landscape completely, like you know what I mean, and go to the external world. So like the idea conceptually that there is an intrinsic happiness, that may be a hard pill to swallow at first, but it's true
Yeah.
and it's there. And if you can swallow that pill, that somewhere in you is this undamaged core of peace, that cultivating that is where the lasting form of contentment can come from. I want to share a story really briefly. Is that cool with you?
Yeah, and then also I want to return to if you were to pursue the enough strategy, what does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. Great. So hold that thought.
Okay.
These two strategies, the enough strategy and the more strategy, came from this group of researchers that I was talking about before, right? And they went. This was in 2014, and they were on this quest to determine the universal emotions, and that those were shame, guilt, regret, fear, anger, happiness, whatever. And all the places they went to, everybody kind of recognized all the emotions in the same way. When they got to this village, it was in the Bhutan region of the Himalayas, and they were with this uncontacted village. Even in that village, they would recognize all of the emotions again, and they were sort of proving them to be universal, except when they got to contentment. And when they got to
Mhm.
contentment, it the reactions from the villagers were wildly different. And the way they described contentment to the researchers showed that the behavior of contentment from their perspective was also different. So the villager, her name was Dr. Dory Wangchuk, if I'm getting that right. She
Mhm.
explained to the researcher, and this was her quote: "In our culture, this emotion, meaning contentment, is very special. It is the highest achievement of human well being, and
Hmm.
it is what the greatest enlightened masters have been writing about for thousands of years." And then the researcher asked her for more clarification and if she could translate the word contentment. And she said it's hard to translate it exactly, but the closest word is chalakshe, which is a very deep and spiritual word that means the knowledge of enough. And it's
Hmm.
basically that word is trying to
Ooh.
communicate what Mo and I have been talking about, which is like this internal understanding, that this internal knowing that right here, right now, everything is perfect as it is, regardless of what I'm experiencing in the outside world. Is, in fact, reminiscent of the perspective that the Toltec take when describing how to live from the Four Agreements. Their
Yeah.
perspective also is that the template, the dream of the planet, the world itself is fine. Nothing's wrong out there. You know what I mean? And I don't mean wrong morally. I mean like
Yeah, there are big moral issues going on.
yeah. What I mean is like there is a template inside the human that has the ability to experience the perfection of this abundant planet we live on, while also living in the reality that humans are creating.
Yeah. I I don't know if this is relevant or not, but I'm just gonna bring it up. I started watching that. I don't know if it's called Our Planet or Planet Earth or whatever that's on Netflix, and like Morgan Freeman is like narrating it or whatever. And it
Okay.
kind of goes back and talks about like the history of the planet and how there have been like multiple, eras of planet Earth where things were, borderline unlivable, and how it becoming borderline unlivable is the only thing that made it possible for mammals to exist on the planet, and all the different phases that it went through. And it something about it, even though it like sounds really horrible that things were like unlivable in multiple different phases, it also kind of like created a sense of contentment and created a sense of like acceptance of like Earth's kind of unstable.
Mm.
And it's never not been unstable. And that sounds like unstable or unlivable are sound like very negative, horrible words, but it is that. And it's not wrong for being that.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. It's definitely not wrong for being that. I love that part. I'm interested in when you describe it as unstable. Like, I love that, and I think that's like you're not wrong. So I'm going to push back, but it's not because I think you're wrong. It's because I think this is what's so interesting about perception, right? Like, from our perception inside the globe, it feels unstable, right? But as you were
Mhm.
talking, it made me think, like, if we zoom out from like a galactic
Mhm.
perspective, like, does the little proton that is Earth, like, in terms of like maybe the actual scientific understanding of some giant being for whom the
Mhm.
galaxy is inside of his kneecap or whatever, like maybe that, maybe planet Earth is a perfectly stable molecule
Yeah,
from that perspective.
in the sense that it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Hmm.
it's in the sense that like the planet doing that, what you're calling instability, created
Yeah.
the environment for mammals to then come into being, right? And so like it's one, we could describe it as unstable because that's the feeling that comes up in us when that environment
Mhm.
shows itself, but we could also describe it as a blessing. You know what I mean? Or we could also describe it as an opportunity because like it is where we came from.
Mhm.
That quote
Yeah.
unquote instability. It's just one way of describing the set of circumstances that are on the
Yeah.
planet.
Yes. And to be clear, we're not condoning corporate greed that's creating human caused climate change. We're not condoning that, but we're just kind of thinking conceptually about the broader like fate of the planet, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And it's this isn't about condoning anything or approving of anything. It's about sort of opening up ourselves, our minds and the minds of anyone out there listening or participating in this to the idea that despite how things look and how things are, contentment is still possible for the human animal, even in the
Mhm.
midst of it all. Like if I was in the middle of some of the horrors and atrocities that are taking place in various parts of the planet right now, I would rather know that there's a place inside me where I can go and find contentment than not know that. So
Yeah.
this isn't about judging people who haven't found it or pretending that the world is somehow fine because I'm content with it. Like that, it's
Yeah.
none of that. Like the world is what it is. There's a lot of awful, terrible stuff going on, and
Mhm.
inside the human being, we have this well. We have this.
Yeah.
We have this place we can go, and this sort of safe container that from the
Yeah.
Latin root that we can build around ourselves called contentment.
Mhm.
And the mystics from many traditions have been trying to show us how to do that. And at this time, more than any other time on the planet, putting that armor of contentment around us is going to help us move through what we're going through. And in fact, from that place of contentment can then come inspired action. Whereas right now, it's like everything is overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
Everything is overwhelming, and so if I let it overwhelm me and I feel fully what all of the trauma and tragedy should do to any person, like that's
Yeah.
immobile, that's then immobilizing, and so that doesn't do anybody any good at all. So in the end, as weird and countercultural as this may sound, cultivating your contentment is the
Mhm.
best thing you can do for every single person you know who's suffering on the planet. Cultivate your own inner contentment because then people can see more and more how and that it's possible. And then the people buried under trauma and tragedy, they may get the sense that, ooh, maybe that's possible for me too. Maybe
Yeah.
that's in there.
And I don't think either of us have an exact roadmap for how to cultivate that contentment necessarily. But I think that the first piece of it is letting go of that more strategy, is recognizing that if I were to spend my entire life trying to achieve more, 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 it's not going to get me that. And if that's not going to get me that, then the approach for me to achieve a baseline level of contentment in my life is going to require something different. And that kind of opens up like weird question in our minds is like, okay, then but how then? But that's exactly the question that you need to be asking that many people go through their entire lives never asking.
Mm-hmm.
How, if not by pursuit of happiness, by pursuit of more?
Yeah, exactly. And no, yeah, the idea that we don't go through our lives and question that strategy is so true because that's like that more strategy is, I mean, we are living through the results of generations past and our current generation too. This is not a blame thing. It's just a noticing thing that we are the living result of society at large pursuing the more strategy and not
Yeah,
seeing clearly that it's not working. This
everything that we live in now is a representation of the fact that everybody's pursuing more.
exactly, and nobody is pursuing the idea that they're already enough. I don't want to say nobody. Of course,
Some, yeah, but like
you know,
in broader cultural,
yeah,
standard. If that were the dominant strategy, then our planet would look very different. Our structure of society, our even our like, governments and education systems would look very different because people's uh I guess structures of motivation for their behavior would be different. There would be like the world wouldn't be profit driven if we weren't stuck in the more strategy.
Yeah, exactly. The more strategy doesn't work, right? It's not working. In fact, there's a quote from the Tao Te Ching, which is this sacred text, and I want to read it because it's actually about how contentment, if we can hold it, can
Mhm.
cascade through all different levels of society.
I like it.
So it feels really apt for what we're bringing up right now. So this
Mhm.
is the quote: "The supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without trying to. It is content with the low places that people disdain. Thus, it is like the Tao. In dwelling, live close to the ground. In thinking, keep to the simple. In conflict, be fair and generous. In governing, don't try to control. In work, do what you enjoy. In family life, be completely present. When you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everybody will respect you. Fill your bowl to the brim and it will spill. Keep sharpening your knife and it will blunt. Chase after money and security and your heart will never unclench. Care about people's approval and you will be their prisoner. Do your work, then step back. The only path to serenity."
The line that stood out to me, well, I guess there were a couple lines that had the same kind of meaning or sense, was keep sharpening your knife and it'll blunt. It's like if I pursue more, I will have less.
Yeah, exactly. And, fill your bowl to the brim and it will spill over, right? So if you get too
Yeah.
much, you lose it anyway and it's a waste.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
So contentment is foundational. It's elusive. It's countercultural. It's rare right now on the planet, even though it's something open to all of us. um,
Yeah.
One thing we didn't talk much about, but I want to just bring up here is that contentment is. We've been talking a lot about the differences between contentment and happiness, right? But
Yeah.
contentment is actually this, like we said before, it's a container, right? And you can feel contentment in other things. So
Mhm.
the main thing that I want people to be able to take away from this is, like, when we say cultivate contentment, we're not saying anything about denying the full range of human emotion. Denying the full
Yeah.
range of human emotion leads to physical problems in your body and it's bad for your mental health. The research
Yeah.
on that is undeniable. And so we're not talking about that. What we're
Yeah.
talking about is cultivating the sense of contentment so that as you experience the full range of human emotions, you experience all of them fully, but within that safe container that you've cultivated for yourself of feeling content with life.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, I want to share an exercise
Okay.
that people can do to cultivate contentment in their lives. But before I do that, are there any other things you wanted to add about contentment or touch on that we didn't say?
I don't think so. I think just to reiterate that, like, when you're coming from a place of contentment, I think partially it looks like non-attachment. It looks like not feeling a need for things to be, like, significantly different than they are, and being able to find whatever is good in wherever things are in that moment.
Yeah, exactly. In that moment, which so hold that thought, everybody, because that is exactly what this exercise is going to help you try to do. Like, in that moment. So there's 7 steps to this, but they're simple. I'm going to tell them to you now. If this is something you're going to want to try later, then you can jot them down. This replay will be up for eternity, so you can also find it that way. Step one is just take a few moments to steady your attention. So it's like step one of any going inward. Just chill.
Mhm.
And then step two is to take a posture that communicates a sense of wakefulness and dignity. So, like, sitting upright. You don't have to.
Mhm.
You can have your back totally supported, or you can, like, be sitting
Yeah.
up, like whatever way you want. And then steady for a few moments on your breath, just anchoring your attention. So it's just like a couple deep breaths, and, like, this doesn't need to be a whole long thing of meditation. You're just getting yourself settled. So these first 3 steps are really just like sit still and calm down. That's steps one
Mhm.
through three. Okay. And then
Yeah.
step four is take a note of any bodily sensations, feelings, or thoughts, allow them to be as they are, with the breath as the anchor for your attention. So, all still just very basic. And then bring into the practice this question: what do I need in this moment to be happy? And what is lacking from this moment? So, those are the questions. You bring that question in. And then, as best as you can, you want to stay very close to that moment. So if you notice your mind wandering into like judging or the wider area of your life, or like what do I need more generally, what do I need this week, then just escort your mind back to this moment where you are right now, sitting in the chair, and say, what do I need in this moment to feel content? What is lacking in this moment? And then this is the final step. So explore within yourself what it is to rest in a moment, one moment at a time, and actually checking in the moment. What do I need? So
Yeah.
that rest in that small space, it's like the little tiny space between ending your out breath and beginning the next breath. It's in that space that you always want to be asking, like, what do I need in this moment? And then give yourself what it is. Like, if you need to move your shoulder, move your shoulder. If you need to lay down, lay down. If you need to
Mhm.
get water. And you just keep doing this practice. So this can be for 5 minutes, it can be for 20 minutes, but it is just so that you're slowing down your life and recognizing this moment, and then this moment, and then this moment, and in each moment bringing contentment into it.
Mm. Something that I'm noticing as I'm kind of actively doing that exercise as you're describing it is that sometimes when you ask yourself that question, what do I need in this moment? Um, Sometimes your brain and body are going to like give you ideas about ways to fill your cup, about ways to take care of yourself. So, like, for example, if I'm thirsty in that moment, like what I need in that moment is to go get a drink. And a lot of times it's going to be very simple things like that. Like, oh, I need to relax my shoulders. Oh, I need to, make sure that I eat, or like don't forget to have a meal, or make sure that I, drink something, or oh, like, it feels like my face is a little greasy. I want to go wash my face. Like it's, like it's going to be like simple things that have an immediate, impact on just your contentment with the moment, but also it's like for me, tell me if it does this for you, Brian, but for me it's like giving me directions on how to care for myself in a way where I feel like I'm okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's giving you an opportunity to go slower. It's giving you an opportunity to check in with sort of a wiser, stronger part of yourself that isn't
Yeah.
usually brought out, because we don't often
Yeah.
ask ourselves, what do I need in general, let alone in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can't tell you how often, like, sometimes I'll have, like, a basic need be, like I forgot to eat or something in the morning because I got, like, really focused on my work, and
Mhm.
then my emotions start to, like, bubble up because I'm hangry, right? And my brain will want to be like, "Oh, I'm having emotions. I'm not happy. It's a problem, like whatever." And try to like solve it with the mind rather than being like, "What do I need in this moment?" Taking care of the body, and then the emotions go away.
It's so true. Because if you were to slow down and say, what do I need in this moment? There is a part of your being that would say nachos or a banana or whatever it is that
Nachos.
you need, you know? So
I love that nachos is the
you would
first
get an
thing.
answer. That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. We don't often practice the art of conversation with the self, but the self is
Yeah.
very attentive to you if you'll allow it to be.
Yeah, it's honestly shocking because I didn't used to have that relationship with myself where I could trust that like an answer would come if I asked my body or if I asked myself. And a lot of people have spent so much of their lives foregoing their needs to please others that like they haven't asked themselves in a long time, like, what do I need in this moment?
Yeah.
Because they're so concerned with other people's, which is, it comes from a kind place, but you can trust, even if you haven't done that in a long time, that it is like a universal truth that your body has wisdom about what your needs are. We're instinctual, like scientific beings that have needs. And I mean, if you look at any other species on the planet, like all species have needs, and we don't fully understand how they just know what it is they're supposed to do to get their needs met. But we are one of those beings. your body and your soul has an innate sense of what it is you need to be able to survive and function.
Yeah, we have the just know quality that the other animals have, but we
Hmm.
haven't learned how to use it because we also have the thinking brain.
Yeah, which gets in the way.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about the nature of intuition and curiosity in a future episode.
Yeah, we should. We definitely should.
We are over though, so in respecting everybody's time, we just want to say thank you all for tuning in. We love having you here, and
Hmm.
we will continue our discussion about emotions next week on Friday at 9 a.m. Eastern. Not sure which emotion we're going to delve into. If anybody out there listening has any thoughts or ideas about topics you want us to cover, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can
Hmm.
ping either Mo or I on our social medias. We're very easily findable. In
Hmm.
the meantime, we will be back next week. Until then, be hot, be messy, and be blessed. Much love, everybody.